Hi guys. So today I'm going to finish talking for our first exam. So it's going to include this last chapter, chapter 19, unit 3, that's on blood vessels. So blood vessels help to deliver blood to the system. Essentially, it works with the lymphatic system to circulate fluid, and this is how we're going to essentially get the needed material throughout our body. It basically begins and ends at the heart. Now, arteries carry blood away from the heart. And so essentially when we talk about this, when we're talking about the systematic system, that blood that goes to the system, right, is going to have oxygen to it. The arteries that carry blood to the lungs, which is a pulmonary circulation, right, that is going to be devoid of oxygen, right? The big part about these is they're just carrying blood away from the heart. Capillaries actually come in direct contact with tissue. So these guys are going to essentially directly serve cellular needs. And the last are veins, and veins carry blood towards the heart. When it's coming essentially back from the systems or from all the organs and tissues, which is called the systematic system, right? Basically, that doesn't have oxygen. But the blood that's coming back from the pulmonary or the lungs, this will have oxygen. So those are the three main structures and their functions to include blood vessels. Now, when we look at this, it's the idea or the relationship to blood vessels. So you have the heart here, right? And so it's showing the arterial system that are composed of arteries. And so you have here elastic arteries, and these are basically the ones that are conducting blood to the different area, muscular arteries that are helping to distribute blood. And then you're going to see that these guys, arterioles, are going to be the very small vessels. As you can see, they start from really big. And so up here, you're talking about something like the aorta. And then you're getting smaller and smaller the farther away you get until essentially these guys are going to come in contact with here, which are capillaries. And the capillaries are the exchange vessels. This is what's going to be over or come in close contact with organs, right? And we're going to look at these more specific here in a second. And then essentially when you come back, you have the things that are a little bit bigger than the capillaries, the venulae, and then those go into small veins and then into large veins. And when we're talking about the large veins, we're talking about things like the vena cava here. And then we'll talk more about the lymphatic system later and how they basically exchange fluids back and forth. So all vessels consist of a lumen. And this is that area that's actually holding blood, and it's surrounded by walls. And the walls can be divided into three parts. So you have the innermost part here, right? And so this actually comes in intimate contact with the heart, and this is the tunica intima. And so this is the part that if you're looking at a blood vessel, the lumen is this major area there, and then the one that actually can come in contact with that is this first layer. The middle layer that has to do with basically constriction and dilation, which has to do with actually enacting muscle control and is basically controlled by sympathetic vasomotor nerve fibers is the tunica media. And the externa is the area that's actually for protection and to reinforce the wall. And it anchors it to the surroundings, different areas. So let's actually look at this as we go through here. And you can see this on both veins and arteries. So essentially, if you look, you can see here, this is the lumen area. This is where the blood is actually going to flow through. So you can see this area in both. Now, right in that, you'll notice that this area right here is the intima area. And so you can see that it has several different layers. You have the endothelium layer, which is the one that comes in direct contact with the actual blood, the subendothelial layer, which is right here, and then this elastic membrane that's here. And so that's on the artery, and you can see again you have the three here for that kind of middle area. Now if we look at the media, which is basically that area in between, right? And so this is where you're going to get the smooth muscles and the elastic fibers here. And you can see all of that in this area and then in this area as well. And then this elastic membrane, of course, is part of that. So this is going to be responsible for constricting and dilating here. And then the last part is the externa, and this, as you can see, is a really thick layer on both sides of this. And then essentially it's made up of collagen fibers, so that should give you an idea there. And that's going to be the thing that's going to be there to help support and protect all of this. And as you can see here at the capillaries, these guys are really, really thin because we're going to mediate the entrance and the exit of gases. So essentially there we want them to be very, very, very thin. So on this you just have the basement membrane that's going to help to give something for the cells to attach to. And then you're going to have this real thin layer of endothelial tissue. So these guys are really, really small, and it just helps mediate the passage of these gases very, very easily. So arteries are divided based on three things, essentially size and function. And so if you look on here, you can see that the elastic artery, which is this first one, has a really, really thick wall here, right? And so the externa is thin. The intima is basically pretty thin too. This is going to give low resistance to the luma. But you're going to notice that you have this really thick middle area here, right? So essentially when we're looking at the elastic arteries, we're looking at things that essentially are going to have some give. And so the aorta and its major branches, also called conducting arteries, lie here. And the reason why they are able to have a lot of give is within this really large media area, we have the fiber elastin. And so that's going to give it some kind of that elastic kind of overall function where it's going to essentially give a little bit more give because there's so much pressure coming out of the heart initially when you're pushing blood out that you don't want it to be so tight that it pops. The next you can look at are these things called muscular arteries. And essentially, these are also known as distribution or distributing arteries. These guys are essentially there to help deliver blood to specific body organs. Now on here, this area is essentially going to be composed. And if you notice, it's kind of a little bit more evened out in here. So when we look at this, and the fact that it doesn't have as much elastin as when we were looking at the elastic arteries, it's mostly composed of muscular, more of a muscular type composition. These are important at withstanding and smoothing out pressure. It essentially allows because it's essentially made up of more things like muscular tissue, this is going to be important in things like vasoconstriction. And these arterioles, these are going to be, if you noticed, essentially these are the really, really small. And so essentially they're going to help, they're just very single layer of smooth muscle. It's smooth muscle. And because they're so small, essentially they're helping to prep the area, and then they're going to flow into the capillaries. So for the most part, you're not getting this right here. You're getting a lot of pressure coming straight out of the heart. So they have to have some flexibility and to smooth out all the different pressure fluctuations due to the heart action. Once we get a little bit farther from the heart, which is the muscular arteries, this is going to be, okay, we need to deliver blood to certain parts and certain organs. Essentially, we're going to do that by either constricting or dilating the arteries in this area to increase the flow or decrease the flow of blood. And then once we get to these, essentially now we're getting the blood, we're farther away from the heart, so we're not having these crazy pressure fluctuations. And at this point, we're just priming it to get it pushed into the capillaries. So elastic arteries do act as pressure reserves. They can expand and recoil as blood is ejected from the heart, and it allows for basically continuous blood flow between heartbeats, and it helps to kind of take out some of that pressure so that you later on don't have to worry about these huge fluctuations. Essentially from here, they are going to give rise to the muscular arteries. Those are also known as distributing arteries. And those arteries are important in delivering blood to body organs. Just kind of reiterating what I just said. Arterioles, these are the smallest of all arteries. You could see that by the picture. And they are regulating blood flow into the capillaries. And they essentially can constrict and dilate small amounts to give just the right amount of resistance the arteries need to make sure that the blood flows nice and evenly to the capillary beds. Now, capillaries are important because they're there to help with exchange of gas, nutrients, waste, and hormones. And so that's going to be between the blood and the interstitial fluid. And the interstitial fluid is a fluid that basically bathes tissue, or bathes the tissues in the organs, right? So essentially it's going to come out of the capillaries through the interstitial tissue to the that's surrounding whatever organ and tissue, and then into that organ and tissue. All the lining of the capillaries, the endothelial cells, are joined together by tight junctions with gap junctions between them called intercellular clefts, and that allows for passage of fluids and very small solids. And there's 3 types of capillaries that we have. So if we look at these 3 capillaries, you'll notice that we have continuous capillaries, right? These are the least permeable and the most common. And if you guys see here, they're abundant in locations like skin, muscle, lungs, and the central nervous system. And essentially, what happens is they basically do pinocytosis of vesicles to take a little bit of the stuff that's on the inside and essentially make it go across the endothelial layer that you see on the outside here. right? And so essentially, that's how they're able to get the solutes or anything that they need from the inside or this lumen area here into the outside. Fenestrated capillaries basically have these really large pores. So do you see these? You don't see them here, right? So you get these super large pores there that are basically, these guys are going to be located in the kidneys and small intestines, or areas that you need active filtration or absorption, right? And so these Swiss cheese-like holes actually tunnel through the endothelial cells or layer, where here what they did is they would basically take and make little vesicles and move across that. These just have really large pores to go straight through it, right? And so these are usually covered by very thin diaphragms made of kind of these extracellular glycoproteins, or these sugar proteins, right? And basically, this outer layer that you have doesn't have little effect on solutes or movements, because you have these really large pores that things can get through. And the sinusoid capillaries are these last ones that you're looking at here. This is located in the liver, the bone marrow, the spleen, and the adrenal medulla. And essentially, they have these large intercellular clefts, right? And so you can see there are, again, the tight junctions that you've seen in all of these. But you can see on here, they have an incomplete basement membrane, where here it basically covered all the way through, and these large clefts that basically open here. They essentially have a regular shape and basically large lumens, right? So blood flows slowly through these and these channels, and essentially allows larger molecules, even cells, to pass along their wall, where these were practically least permeable to stuff. These guys are the most permeable. So essentially, it goes in permeability increases. And you can see probably why, because of these large holes. So essentially, capillary beds are these interwoven networks of capillaries that rest between arterioles and venules. And essentially, it helps with what's called microcirculation, or basically, you're going to have this flow of blood that goes through these beds. There's two types of capillary beds, consist of two types of vessels, more so. Vascular shunts, which essentially are these channels that connect between the arteries or arterioles directly through the venules, and true capillaries, which are actual vessels involved in exchanging. And so you can see the two differences here. So when we're talking about the anatomy, or actually more so the anatomy of capillary beds, what we're talking about is this area here. So here you're looking at the arterioles and the venules here. So blood is coming in here and coming into this area, and blood is leaving here, and this is going back to the heart, right? To heart, from heart. And so you have these precapillary sphincters, and the same thing as if we're going to talk about stomach. These guys, when they're open, blood can flow through, and when they're closed, blood will stop, right? And so these guys out here are the true capillaries, because this is essentially what is going to allow, once the blood comes through here, that's going to allow things like oxygen and glucose and all those actually out into the very the interstitial fluid that we're essentially looking at, right? Now, when these sphincters are closed, what happens is that basically you're going to go through this area straight through here, right? And this is what we're looking at. These were up here. This is a vascular shunt that goes through here. And basically, it will bypass all of these true capillaries, so you're not going to get the blood flowing into the true capillary, so you're not going to get a diffusion. So depending on the needs of the tissue or the organ at the time depends on whether these are going to be open or closed. Now, capillaries are just big enough for about one red blood cell, a single red blood cell, to go through, right? And then when we're talking about veins, essentially veins carry blood. Is it away or towards the heart? Towards. Right? So basically it starts in venules, which are the small ones that we talked about that come out of the capillaries, and then it gets larger and larger and larger and emerges into large veins, right? So the bigger they are, basically the closer to the heart you get. They're going to have large lumens and essentially very thin walls, make veins very good as a storage vessel, right? And so they essentially have the ability to act as a blood reserve because essentially they contain about 65% of all the blood supply. And so we looked at this in class, but you can kind of get an idea of the general structure of arteries and veins here. You can see arteries are a bit bigger and seem to be have a little bit more structure or symmetrical structure compared to veins. And when we go look at blood volume throughout the cardiovascular system, essentially what you're going to see is, as I said before, the biggest brunt of the blood that we have pumping throughout our system are in systematic veins and venules, right? The next is essentially the arteries or arterioles, and followed last by the pulmonary blood vessels. So this is to the lungs, right? Or not to the lungs, but we're talking about coming back from the lungs. And this is coming back from the rest of the body, which should make sense because this is so much larger, right? And then heart is only 8% and capillaries are only 5% because you have to look at relative size here. So blood pressure is lower in arteries. So adaptions ensure return of blood to the heart. So large diameter of the lumen offers very little resistance. So we have these other adaptions that have happened to make sure that we can get blood back to the heart to continually to be pumping. So we have these things called venous valves and venous sinuses. And essentially the venous valves are here to prevent backflow of blood. With the arteries, we're having this really large amount of pressure coming out of the heart, forcing everything to go out. The thing is that the farther away you get from the heart, the least amount of pressure you have. And then think you're coming all the way back, there's this big circle that's coming around. So since we have less pressure in the veins, we have to come up with these ways to make sure that the blood doesn't, for instance, if it pumps out of the heart and goes down back to your feet, essentially you have gravity pushing down. So we have to figure out a way to get, with not as much pressure coming back, we have to figure out a way to get the blood to come back. So the valves essentially are there to help prevent backflow, so that essentially once the blood flows over this, it can't go back. And so you're looking at this happening most abundant in the veins of the limbs. And the venous sinuses, these are basic flattened veins. And they have extremely thin walls. And these are going to be composed only of endothelial tissue. And this is basically examples of this, where you're going to find these. that essentially help to bring blood back are basically in the coronary sinus of the heart, and the dural sinuses of the brain. And here you can see these things are much closer to the heart than the extremities are. And so here, basically, when we're talking about varicose veins, these are the valves that we have to help protect, and they become incompetent. So if you look, essentially, when we're talking about these valves working, what we're talking about is as the blood comes up, it comes up, and then essentially these things are here to make it so they can't go back. Now, if they start becoming compromised, you'll notice here that they're starting to kind of weigh a little bit and come so blood can flow backwards, and thus blood starts pooling, so you get these things called varicose veins, because essentially you cannot, you can't, because you don't have this, it's essentially weakened itself. So essentially the blood just continues to pool and it's not being forced back up from those veins. And so you get kind of this whole look, and it becomes very much apparent on legs, and it can be very, very painful. And so what contributes to this is basically heredity has a lot to do with this. You can also get it for jobs where you're prolonged standing in one position, obesity, pregnancy, all of these things. And a lot of times, sometimes this can help you a lot. If you wear like compression socks or pantyhose or anything like that, that helps to keep pressure on the legs, can help with this during times for which you are standing long hours. What they do a lot now times, if it's not extremely bad, what they can do is there are different lasers they can do. Sometimes if they're really, really small and they're not really apparent, they'll just blow them out, like go and make them pop. Other times they have lasers that they can do to help with this. When you have extra pressure, can also, elevated venous pressure can cause varicose veins. And this can happen in areas towards the rectum. And that's essentially what happens when we're looking at hemorrhoids here. So when you deliver a baby or have a bowel movement, you're actually increasing the intra-abdominal pressure. And this can result in varicosities that in anal veins, and these pops can come out and kind of there. And so a lot of times either they can be reduced and brought back into the rectum in that area, or sometimes you have to get them surgically removed. So just a quick, and I'm really close to being done with this. We're just going to talk really quick about blood flow, blood pressure, and resistance. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this video, and I'm going to start this again here in a few minutes.